"Dad, don't sign that," the little girl said, and the sentence sliced through the ballroom so cleanly it seemed to hush even the crystal chandeliers above them. Ethan Whitmore's pen stopped one breath before the paper. Around him, the ballroom of the Whitmore Children's Foundation Gala glowed in polished gold and soft amber, all marble floors, violin music, and women in silk gowns that whispered when they moved. Waiters in white jackets drifted between tables carrying champagne and tiny crab cakes on silver trays. The whole room had been trained to orbit Ethan Whitmore without ever touching him. The billionaire host with the calm voice, the measured smile, and the kind of presence that made people lower their laughter by instinct. But now every eye had turned toward the doorway. A little black girl stood there in a navy coat too thin for the November cold, the hem brushing her knees, her shoes worn pale at the toes from too much walking. She couldn't have been older than 9. Her braids were neat but slightly loosened at the edges, as if somebody had done them with care 3 days ago and hoped they would hold a little longer. In one hand she clutched a folded paper swan, creased and soft from being opened too many times. In the other, she held nothing at all, which somehow made her look even smaller in a room built for people with bodyguards, private jets, and names printed on hospital wings. "Sir," one security guard said quietly, already moving. Victoria Whitmore lifted one manicured hand before he could reach the child. "It's all right," she said, smiling the way certain women smiled when they wanted cruelty to look elegant. Her white gown shimmered beneath the chandelier light like fresh ice on a lake. Diamonds flashed at her throat. "Sweetheart," she said to the girl, her tone dipped in honey and distance. "You must be confused. This is a private event." The girl did not look at her. Her eyes stayed on Ethan. That was what made the room uneasy. Not the interruption. Not the fact that a child had somehow crossed the velvet ropes and 2 layers of security. It was the way she looked at him. Not like a fan, not like a frightened kid, but like someone who had carried his face in her mind for years and had finally grown tired of being told to keep quiet. Ethan slowly set the pen down beside the leather folder in front of him. The trustees seated nearby exchanged glances. A donor coughed into his napkin. Somewhere behind the string quartet, a glass touched marble with a tiny accidental click. "Who are you?" Ethan asked. His voice was level, but the line between his brows had deepened. The girl swallowed. He saw it. Saw the thin movement in her throat, the quick rise of her small shoulders beneath the coat. She was scared. She was doing this anyway. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said. The surname hung in the air for half a second longer than it should have. Victoria's posture changed almost invisibly, only a slight tightening through the shoulders, but Ethan caught it because Ethan caught everything. He had built an empire off what other people missed. The tremor in a handshake, the pause before a lie, the confidence of someone who thought they could outsmart him. "And why?" Ethan said. "Would you interrupt my event, Naomi Carter?" Her fingers tightened around the paper swan until the edges bent. "Because if you sign that tonight," she said, glancing toward the folder on the table, "she wins again." A murmur rippled across the room, low and fast. Victoria let out the faintest laugh, more breath than sound. "Again?" she repeated, almost amused. "This is absurd." Naomi finally turned toward her, and for the first time the child's composure flickered. Not into anger, into grief. Old grief, the kind that sits too heavily inside a person so young. "My mama told me if I ever got the chance, I had to tell him before it was too late." Ethan felt something in his chest shift, slight but real, like a locked drawer inside him sliding open 1 inch. He did not understand it yet. He only knew the room no longer felt warm. "Tell me what?" he asked. Naomi stepped forward 1 pace. Her shoes made almost no sound on the marble, but every head in the ballroom followed that tiny movement as if the floor itself had spoken. Her eyes were dark, bright, and terribly steady now. "That you've been lied to," she said. "For years." Victoria's smile thinned. "Security," she said again, this time colder. 2 men started forward from the side wall, but Ethan did not look at them. He was staring at the paper swan in Naomi's hand. Something about it had caught in his mind before he could stop it. The fold, the faded blue ink near one wing. The memory came not as a full picture, but as a sensation first. The smell of rain on a car window, a woman laughing softly in the dark, his own hand writing words on a scrap of stationery, because she had once told him she kept little things longer than jewelry. Naomi saw his eyes drop to it. Without breaking his gaze, she unfolded the swan carefully, as if it might tear from the weight of the truth inside it. Then she held it out with both hands. Ethan rose from his chair before he seemed to realize he was standing. The violin music had stopped. So had every conversation in the room. He took the paper from the little girl's fingers, and the moment he saw the words written inside, the color drained from his face. In his own handwriting, slightly younger, less guarded, were 6 words he had not seen in nearly a decade. For my little swan. Find me. The room disappeared around him. The marble, the donors, the cameras, the floral arrangements flown in from California that morning. All of it fell away beneath one brutal, impossible fact. He knew those words. He knew exactly who he had written them for. And when he looked back up at Naomi, the little girl was already crying without making a sound. My mama kept it, she whispered. She said you never abandoned us. She said somebody made sure you never knew. Ethan did not move for several seconds. He just stood there beneath the gold wash of chandelier light, the unfolded paper trembling once between his fingers before he tightened his grip and made it still. Naomi remained where she was, small and straight-backed in the middle of a ballroom, full of people who had spent their lives believing money could keep disorder outside the door. It was strange, the way silence changed shape. A moment ago it had been polished, social, expensive. Now it felt thin and raw, as if one more breath might tear it open. Victoria recovered first. She always did. That was one of the things Ethan had once admired about her, her ability to step into a room and make uncertainty feel embarrassed for showing itself. She glided to his side, one hand brushing the sleeve of his tuxedo with practiced ease. Ethan, she said softly, low enough that it could almost pass for concern. This child is clearly repeating something she does not understand. Let me have someone take her somewhere warm, get her some food, call social services if necessary. Naomi flinched at none of it. She only watched Ethan, waiting. There was no demand in her face. No wild hope either. Just a terrible patience no 9-year-old should have learned. Ethan looked down at the page again. The ink had faded to a dusty blue, but the slant of the letters was unmistakable. He could see himself writing them in the back seat of a town car after a stormy benefit dinner on the Upper East Side, laughing quietly because Lena had teased him for buying her flowers when she preferred folded paper birds. Lena. The name did not hit him gently. It moved through him like old music heard through a wall, recognizable before it was clear, carrying with it rain on brownstone windows, coffee gone cold on a windowsill, a woman with warm brown skin and serious eyes smiling only after she had decided someone had earned it. He had not said her name out loud in years. Not because he had forgotten. Because remembering had become its own form of humiliation. He had been told she left. Told she had taken money and disappeared. Told she wanted freedom, not him, and certainly not the future he had offered. He had believed it because the alternative was uglier. The alternative was that he had failed to protect something precious before it had even become official. Where did you get this? He asked. His voice was different now. Not louder. Just stripped down, like a room after the guests leave. Naomi answered right away. My mama kept it in a tin box under her bed. Ethan lifted his eyes to her. Your mother's name. Naomi drew in a breath. Lena Carter. The room reacted to the name in scattered ways. Most people meant nothing by it because it meant nothing to them. One trustee frowned. Another looked discreetly away. But Ethan felt Victoria's hand slip from his sleeve, and in that tiny retreat there was more truth than in 100 polished explanations. That is not possible, Victoria said, and the speed of her answer made half the room look at her before they looked back at Ethan. Lena Carter vanished years ago. You told me that yourself. Ethan did not answer her. Naomi did. She did not vanish, the girl said, her voice shaking now at the edges though she kept going. She got sick. Then she got scared. Then she ran out of time. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. He thought of hospital corridors for reasons he could not yet name. The stale smell of coffee from vending machines, fluorescent light on tile. The way bad news always made ordinary walls feel cruel. You should not be here alone, he said, almost without meaning to. Naomi's chin lifted a fraction. I am not alone. Ethan glanced toward the doors, half expecting to see some frantic adult rushing in after her, but there was no one. Only waiters frozen at the perimeter and donors pretending not to stare while staring at everything. Naomi pressed a hand to the front of her coat. My mama sent me with what she left, she said. And Mrs. Brooks told me if I made it past the front steps, I had to tell the truth before the papers came out. At that, a visible ripple moved through the crowd. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks had worked in Ethan's homes longer than almost anyone. She had seen marriages begin, children of guests grow up, board members come and go, seasons of the family carved into holiday silver and summer luggage. She was not dramatic. She was not reckless. And at the edge of the ballroom, near a service door half hidden by a towering arrangement of white orchids, Ethan now saw her. She stood very still in her dark uniform, gloved hands clasped too tightly at her waist. Even from across the room, he could see the fear in her face. Not surprise. Fear. Victoria turned sharply. Evelyn, she said, and though she did not raise her voice, the room heard the command inside it. Mrs. Brooks took one hesitant step forward. Her sensible shoes made a faint tap against the marble. Sir, she said, eyes fixed on Ethan, not on Victoria. I told the child only that if she truly had something from Miss Lena, you deserved to see it before anything was signed tonight. Ethan felt the leather folder on the table beside him like a second pulse. The trust documents. The revised estate structure. The papers Victoria had urged him to finalize before midnight because the board wanted certainty, because public optics mattered, because old loose ends invited trouble. A cold understanding began, not fully formed but already poisonous. Naomi had said she wins again. Again. He looked from the folder to Victoria, from Victoria to the child, and the ballroom that had taken months to stage suddenly felt like scenery built around a trap. Everybody out, Ethan said quietly. No one moved. He did not lift his voice, but something in it changed the air. Now. Chairs shifted. Shoes whispered over marble. The trustees gathered their things too quickly. The quartet lowered their instruments. Champagne flutes were abandoned half full on linen-draped tables. In less than a minute the ballroom had begun to empty, leaving behind only the hush of expensive fabric, the scent of candle wax and cut lilies, and the small sound of Naomi breathing as if she had been holding herself together for miles and miles, and was not yet sure she was allowed to stop. The ballroom emptied in layers, like a tide pulling silk and perfume and polite shock back out into the night. Doors closed softly. Voices faded into the corridor. What remained was stranger than noise. Candlelight trembled against the marble walls. Half-finished glasses of champagne stood abandoned on linen-covered tables, their pale gold surfaces catching the chandeliers in broken reflections. A violin rested alone on a chair near the stage, forgotten by a musician who had left too quickly to remember it. Naomi stood in the middle of all that wealth with her coat still buttoned to the throat, as if she had not yet accepted that she was meant to stay. Ethan remained at the head table, one hand flat against the edge, the folded page still in the other. Victoria had not moved far. She stood 3 feet to his right, posture flawless, face composed, only the tightness at the corners of her mouth betraying that this was no longer a scene she controlled. Mrs. Brooks lingered near the service entrance, pale and rigid, as though she had spent years preparing herself for this exact moment and still found herself unready when it arrived. Ethan looked at Naomi for a long time before he spoke. You said your mother is gone. Naomi nodded once. The movement was small, careful. She died 6 days ago. The words did not land with drama. They landed with weight. Ethan felt them settle somewhere low in his body, heavy and cold. 6 days. A week ago he had been in San Francisco arguing over a pediatric hospital acquisition. 3 days ago he had stood in a television studio smiling through an interview about legacy, family, and responsible wealth. While somewhere not far enough away for comfort, a woman he had once loved enough to rewrite his future had died, and no one had told him. His jaw tightened. How? He asked, then immediately hated the bluntness of it. Naomi seemed not to. Children who had lived around sickness often learned to hear hard questions without flinching. Cancer, she said. It started a long time ago, but she got worse this fall. She tried to stay until Christmas. She said she wanted one more tree, even if it was just a little one from the dollar store. Her voice caught for the first time on the word little. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor until the tremble passed. Ethan stared at the marble between them because it was easier than looking at the child and seeing what his absence had cost. He pictured a discount store Christmas tree under weak apartment lighting. He pictured Lena decorating it with hands too tired to lift much, making something ordinary feel magical, because that was the kind of woman she had been. He had once told her she could make a bus stop feel like a memory worth keeping. Why now? Victoria asked, and though her tone remained smooth, impatience showed through like a stain under white fabric. If this story were true, why come tonight? Why not go to a lawyer? Why not the press? Naomi looked up at her. There was no meanness in the child's face, only a kind of exhausted clarity that made Victoria, for the first time, appear overdressed and overgrown. Because my mama said lawyers listen to money first, Naomi answered. And the press listens to whatever sounds prettier on television. She said if I wanted him to hear me, I had to tell him before you made him sign anything. Ethan turned slowly toward Victoria. What did she mean by that? Victoria gave a soft laugh that belonged in a dining room. Not here. Ethan, please. The child is grieving. Someone has clearly filled her head with suspicion and old stories. The trust revisions tonight are routine. Your attorneys drafted them months ago. Routine, Mrs. Brooks repeated quietly from across the room, and the single word had enough steel in it to make even Victoria glance her way. Ethan had known Evelyn Brooks for 17 years. He had seen her calm, frantic staff during storms, carry crying flower girls through wedding rehearsals, and once stare down a United States senator who had insulted a housekeeper. She did not speak carelessly. Say what you need to say, Ethan told her. Mrs. Brooks drew a breath. The envelope arrived this afternoon by courier. No return address. It was addressed to Miss Naomi in Miss Lena's handwriting, care of my name, at the old East Side residence. Naomi reached into her coat and pulled out a second item, this time not folded paper, but a small brass key on a faded blue ribbon. It opened the box under her bed, she said. There was a letter for me and one for you, but she told me not to give yours to anyone else, not even if they smiled and said they were helping. Ethan felt the room tilt slightly, not in motion but in certainty. Lena had expected resistance. Lena had planned around it. Where is the letter? He asked. Naomi touched the inside pocket of her coat, then hesitated. Her eyes moved, just for a second, to Victoria. That tiny glance told Ethan more than pages of testimony. Whatever Naomi had lived through these last few days, she had already learned exactly who in this room she should fear. Ethan stepped away from the table and crossed the marble floor toward her. He stopped several feet short so he would not crowd her. Up close, she looked even younger than he had thought. There were shadows beneath her eyes. The cuff of her coat was frayed. One of her braids had come loose near her temple, and a small gold bead at the end of it caught the chandelier light when she breathed. Naomi, he said, and his voice lowered without his permission, gentled by something older than reason. You can give it to me. She searched his face with a seriousness that did not belong on any child. Then, slowly, she slipped her hand into her pocket and brought out a sealed envelope, worn at the corners, his name written across the front in Lena's unmistakable hand. Ethan Whitmore. No title, no accusation, just his name, as if she still believed he was a man before he was an empire. He reached for it. Before his fingers touched the paper, Victoria said, very quietly, Ethan, do not be naive. And that was the moment he knew this night had nothing to do with confusion at all. Ethan took the envelope from Naomi with the care of a man handling something far more fragile than paper. The cream stock had softened at the edges from being hidden, moved, protected. His name in Lena's handwriting reached across the years with a steadiness that made his throat tighten before he had even broken the seal. The ballroom felt colder now, though the chandeliers still cast their flattering gold over the marble and the long tables dressed in white linen. Somewhere in the building a service elevator chimed, distant and ordinary, and the sound felt almost offensive against the silence gathering around them. Naomi stood with both hands clasped in front of her coat, shoulders drawn in, not from the temperature, but from the effort of staying brave. Mrs. Brooks had inched closer without seeming to move, her lined face tense with the kind of dread that comes only when truth has waited too long. Victoria remained where she was, elegant and pale beneath the lights, but Ethan no longer saw refinement when he looked at her. He saw calculation. He saw timing. He saw the tiny, unmistakable flicker in her eyes when the envelope changed hands, as if something carefully stacked inside her mind had just begun to slide. "You told me not to be naive," Ethan said, not looking up yet. "That suggests you already know what this is." Victoria folded her arms lightly, a motion designed to look composed. "I know grief when I see it," she said. "And I know manipulation when it arrives dressed as innocence. Ethan, this girl is carrying a story that was planted in her by someone desperate enough to use a child after death." Naomi flinched at the word used, not because it was loud, but because it was cruel in the polished way cruelty often is among rich people. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed everything now. "Do not talk about her mother like that," he said. His voice never rose, but Victoria went still. In all the years she had known him, Ethan Whitmore had rarely needed volume. The quietest version of him was often the most dangerous because it meant he was no longer performing calm. He was simply done pretending. He slipped a thumb beneath the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written on 2 sheets of lined paper, folded 3 times, the ink slightly uneven in places as if the hand holding the pen had not always been steady. A faint medicinal scent clung to it, something clean and bitter beneath the softer smell of paper kept too long in a closed box. Ethan read the first line and stopped breathing for a second. "If Naomi is the one placing this in your hands, then I did not live long enough to tell you face to face." The chandeliers above him seemed suddenly too bright. He read on. "Ethan, I know what you were told about me. I know because every door I tried to open was already closed before I reached it. Every call went unanswered. Every letter came back or disappeared. I learned too late that some people do not need to shout to take a life apart. They only need access, timing, and your trust." Ethan's hand tightened on the page. He could feel Naomi watching him, not with expectation but with a child's terrible alertness, measuring whether this would be the moment another grown person decided her truth was inconvenient. His eyes moved lower. "I did not leave you. I never wanted your money. I never asked for your name on anything. I only wanted you to know your daughter existed, because she had your eyes when she was thinking and your stubborn silence when she was hurt. Her name is Naomi. I named her that because it means pleasantness, and I wanted one gentle thing in a season that had become all edges." Ethan looked up then, startled by the sting gathering behind his eyes. Naomi met his gaze without blinking. There it was now that Lena had written it. Impossible to ignore, the reflection of himself in the child's expression when she held still and braced against disappointment. Victoria stepped forward, the silk of her gown whispering over the floor. "This proves nothing," she said. "Anyone could write a letter. Anyone could teach a child a script." Mrs. Brooks inhaled sharply, but it was Naomi who spoke. "She did not teach me a script," the girl said, her voice small and steady. "She taught me what kind of tie you wear when you are nervous. She taught me you tap your thumb against your coffee cup when you are trying not to show you are angry. She taught me you do not like lilies in the house because they remind you of funerals." Ethan's eyes shifted at once toward the massive arrangements of white lilies lining the ballroom walls, flowers Victoria had personally selected for the gala because she said they looked timeless in photographs. He had objected to them for reasons he had never fully explained, then let it go because it seemed easier. A strange expression crossed Mrs. Brooks's face, part sorrow, part vindication. Victoria opened her mouth, but Ethan lifted one hand, and she fell silent. He returned to the letter. Lena had written of hospital waiting rooms and cheap motels, of borrowed rides, and changing phone numbers after strangers began appearing too close to wherever she stayed. She wrote that twice she had come within blocks of Ethan's office only to be stopped by men who already knew her name and told her she was trespassing. She wrote that once, when Naomi was barely 2, a woman in a cream coat had approached her outside a clinic and offered money enough to disappear quietly. No threats, no shouting, just a smile and a sentence. "You will not be believed over people who belong in his life." Ethan read that line twice, then a third time. He did not need it signed in blood to know whose voice Lena had heard. He had listened to Victoria make cruelty sound gracious for years. He had simply never imagined being one of its targets. At the bottom of the second page, Lena's handwriting weakened but did not lose its shape. "If there is still time when you read this, do not sign anything she places in front of you until you know where your daughter stands in it." That was when Ethan understood the true weight of Naomi's warning. This was not only about the past. Whatever papers waited on the gala table, whatever revisions had been dressed up as efficiency and legacy. Planning, they were part of the same design. He lowered the letter slowly. The ballroom seemed to narrow, the air sharpening around the three of them like glass. "Get Harold Benton on the phone," he said to Mrs. Brooks without taking his eyes off Victoria. "Now." Mrs. Brooks moved at once, relief and fear crossing her face so quickly they almost looked like the same emotion. She turned toward the service entrance. Already reaching into the pocket of her uniform for the small phone she kept for household emergencies, the kind that never rang for trivial things. Her shoes tapped softly across the marble, then disappeared beyond the orchids and the half-shadowed corridor. The sound left behind was smaller now. Candle flames. The low hum of the ventilation system. Naomi's careful breathing. Ethan stood with Lena's letter still open in his hand, the pages no longer feeling like paper at all, but like a door he had once pounded on in his sleep and found open only after it was too late. Victoria did not step back. That was one of the things that made her formidable. Even cornered, she understood posture. She understood the theater of innocence. "Ethan," she said, and her voice dropped into that intimate register she used when she wanted the rest of the world to feel excluded. "You are letting grief and guilt make you vulnerable to a setup that has all the marks of premeditation. A dead woman leaves a dramatic letter. A child appears at a gala moments before estate papers are signed. A longtime employee helps orchestrate access. This is not revelation. It is staging." Ethan folded the letter with slow precision, more to keep his hands steady than to protect the page. "You are right about one thing," he said. This was timed. He looked at the trust folder on the table, thick cream pages clipped inside a navy leather binder embossed with his foundation crest. Hours earlier it had seemed like one more item in a life built from decisive signatures and clean transactions. Now it looked like an instrument laid out in plain sight. He picked it up and turned the first few pages. The legal language was familiar enough in structure, but he was no estate attorney, and that was by design. Wealth-created documents so dense they could hide intent and elegance. Naomi watched him silently. Her eyes followed the movement of his hands, not greedy, not curious, but intent in the way of children who had learned that adults often buried the most important truths in the moments they thought nobody was looking. "What is that?" she asked quietly. Ethan glanced at her. "A revised trust structure," he said. The answer sounded cold in the ballroom, far too technical beside a little girl in a worn coat. He softened it. "Papers that decide where things go. Money, property, voting rights tied to the family foundation. What happens later, after I am gone." Naomi absorbed that with the solemn concentration of a child trying to understand a game invented by people far older and richer than anyone she knew. "And she wanted you to sign it tonight." Ethan did not answer immediately. He scanned the summary page. The changes had been presented as housekeeping, streamlining authority, consolidating decision-making, reducing future disputes. Words like efficiency and protection. Words people trusted because they sounded responsible. Then he saw a clause referenced under contingent heirs, a restructuring of beneficiary classes linked to formal acknowledgement, timelines, and standing documentation lodged prior to execution. The language was polished enough to pass unnoticed in a room full of champagne and applause. But with Lena's warning still warm in his mind, the clause no longer read like housekeeping. It read like a lock installed on a door before the rightful person knew the house existed. "Yes," he said at last. Naomi's small fingers tightened around each other. "Then my mama was right." Victoria laughed once, but the sound broke in the middle and came out too brittle. "This is absurd. Ethan, are you truly going to let a child interpret estate law now?" He looked up. "No, that is what Harold Benton is for. The difference is that I am finally going to ask why this needed to be signed before midnight, and why the language changed 3 times this quarter without you ever once mentioning a contingent heir exclusion tied to prior acknowledgement." For the first time that night, Victoria lost the seamless rhythm of her expression. Not much, just enough. A blink too slow, a stillness too complete. Ethan had spent his adult life reading markets, negotiators, rivals, and boardrooms. He knew when someone had expected to stay a step ahead and suddenly realized they no longer were. Naomi saw it too, though perhaps not in legal terms. The child simply looked from Ethan to Victoria and back again, then lowered her gaze to the floor as if she did not want to witness a grown woman's face cracking under the strain of being found out. "You are talking like I drafted this myself," Victoria said. Your attorneys handled every revision. At whose request? Ethan asked. At the recommendation of people whose job is to anticipate problems. Problems, Naomi repeated under her breath, and something about the innocence of the word in her voice made the whole room feel ashamed. Ethan turned toward her fully then. Naomi, who brought you here tonight? She looked up, startled by the gentleness in his tone. Mrs. Brooks sent a car after school got out, she said. But I took the subway first because I thought she might change her mind if I got there too soon. Ethan blinked. You were at school today? Naomi nodded. Until lunchtime. Then the principal said I could leave because of the funeral week. I still had my spelling packet in my backpack. She glanced toward a chair near the ballroom door, where a small purple backpack now sat half-hidden behind a drape, absurdly ordinary in this room of diamonds and donor plaques. A child had come to confront a billionaire carrying schoolwork. The fact struck Ethan with more force than any accusation could have. He imagined her on the subway, feet not touching the floor from the plastic seat, coat zipped all the way up, clutching Lena's letter while office workers stared past her and trains rattled through the dark beneath Manhattan. 9 years old, and already moving through a city that had taught her how invisible she could be. Did anyone try to stop you? He asked. Naomi hesitated. The silence lasted only 2 seconds, but it was enough. At the front. Ethan pressed, and her eyes shifted again, not to Victoria this time, but toward the ballroom entrance. Ethan followed the glance and saw one of the security supervisors standing outside the glass doors, face pale, pretending to study his earpiece. Twice, Naomi said. The first man said the guest list had no Carter on it. The second one got a call, and then told me I should go home because Mr. Whitmore does not meet with strangers. But Mrs. Brooks came down the side stairs and said if I could stand still and keep my head down for 5 minutes, she could get me into the back corridor before the toast. Ethan let that settle. Somewhere between the house staff, the security chain, and the timing of the event, too many people had been prepared for this child before he even knew she existed. He placed the trust binder back on the table with care that bordered on contempt. No one, he said, his gaze fixed on Victoria, goes to that much trouble unless they are afraid of what a little girl might say. Mrs. Brooks returned less than a minute later, her phone still in her hand, her breathing controlled but not fully steady. Mr. Benton is on his way from the townhouse, she said. He was reviewing the final gala transfers nearby. He said 15 minutes. Ethan nodded once. 15 minutes. In most rooms that was nothing. In this one it felt like the length of a confession. Naomi had drifted half a step closer to the end of the long table, not out of boldness, but because children moved toward whatever looked most solid when the world turned uncertain. Under the chandelier glow her face looked tired in a way no child's face should. There was a faint shadow beneath each eye, and Ethan noticed for the first time that the cuff of her left sleeve had been hand-stitched where the seam had come loose. Lena had mended it, he thought instinctively, and the thought struck with such force that he had to look away. Victoria did not miss that either. She drew in a breath through her nose, slow and measured, then stepped toward the table and placed 2 fingers lightly on the trust binder, as if reclaiming ownership through touch alone. Ethan, enough, she said. This has already gone far beyond dignity. You have indulged a dramatic interruption. You have read a letter with no chain of custody, no verification, and no context beyond grief. But if you continue down this road in front of staff, in front of legal counsel, in front of anyone who can repeat what they have seen tonight, you will create exactly the kind of public scandal your enemies spend fortunes hoping for. Ethan looked at her then, fully. He had seen Victoria navigate crises before, had admired the icy intelligence with which she could pull a room back from panic. But tonight the polish had changed temperature. It no longer felt strategic. It felt desperate. My enemies? He asked. Or yours? Victoria's expression barely shifted, but the pause before her answer stretched just a little too long. Do not be theatrical, she said. Naomi lowered her eyes, though not before Ethan caught the flicker of discomfort on her face. Children always knew when adults were speaking around the truth instead of through it. The room smelled faintly of wax, roses, and the remains of catered food cooling under silver covers. Somewhere in the kitchen a tray clattered and was instantly silenced. The whole building seemed to understand that something delicate and ruinous was taking place in the ballroom. Ethan set Lena's letter beside the binder and rested both palms on the white linen tablecloth. "Naomi," he said quietly, "tell me exactly what your mother told you about tonight." The girl looked up at once. She was scared, that much was obvious, but there was relief in being asked a plain question after so much speaking around her. She said if anything happened to her before she could make you listen, I had to wait until you were about to sign something important, Naomi said. She said that is when rich people stop listening to everyone except the person standing closest to their pen. Mrs. Brooks made a sound so small, it was almost only breath. Ethan's jaw tightened. The sentence sounded like Lena, sharp in its truth, almost dry in its sadness. He could hear her saying it with one eyebrow raised, trying to keep fear from becoming performance in front of a child. Naomi continued, clasping and unclasping her fingers. She said I had to tell you two things before you signed. First, that I am yours. Second, that if my name was not already protected in those papers, then somebody made sure it would not be after. Victoria gave a short, incredulous laugh. Protected? She speaks as if a 9-year-old understands inheritance law. I understand being left out on purpose, Naomi said, and the softness of her voice made the sentence land harder than anger would have. No one spoke for a moment. Ethan felt that line move through the room, like cold air finding a crack under a door. He looked again at the child's purple backpack near the drape, at the cheap zipper charm shaped like a star, at the tiny ordinary life that had somehow entered this palace of marble and donor plaques carrying more truth than the adults in custom silk and black tie. What else did your mother leave? He asked. Naomi reached slowly into her coat again. This time she drew out a small digital recorder, scratched on one side, the kind sold near checkout counters in pharmacies and office supply stores. She held it in both hands as if it might be breakable, though it was clearly old enough to have survived years in drawers and coat pockets. She said the battery was weak, Naomi whispered. But she saved the most important part. Victoria's face changed then, not dramatically, not enough for anyone who did not know how to watch closely, but Ethan knew how to watch. Color drained slightly from beneath her makeup. Her shoulders went very still. No, she said too fast. Ethan's gaze snapped to her. You know what is on it. I know nothing of the kind, she replied. But her voice had gone flatter, stripped of its social warmth. Naomi looked at Ethan, not Victoria. She made it the week she got out of the hospital the first time, the girl said. She said if anything ever happened and people acted like she was confused, then this was for you. She said even if her face changed and her hair was gone and she sounded tired, you would know her voice. Ethan did not realize he had stopped breathing until his chest began to ache from it. Lena, sitting somewhere under fluorescent light or by a cheap lamp in a rented room, speaking into a machine because paper alone might not survive the people standing between them. Naomi held the recorder out. I never played all of it, she admitted. She told me not to. She said some things belonged to the person they were meant for. Ethan reached for it, but before his hand closed around the device, Victoria moved toward the child with a suddenness that made Mrs. Brooks step between them on instinct. There was no contact, no raised voice, just a flash of intent that revealed too much. Victoria stopped short, the silk of her gown whispering against the marble. That recording could be edited, she said. Manufactured. You are allowing yourself to be played by a dead woman who could not let go and a child too young to know she is being used. Naomi's hand trembled once. Ethan saw it. He took the recorder from her gently and curled his fingers around it like he was taking custody of something sacred. Then he looked at Victoria with a steadiness that made the whole ballroom seem to shrink around them. The only person in this room, he said, who keeps telling me not to look closer is you. For a few seconds no one moved. The recorder sat in Ethan's hand, light as plastic and heavy as consequence, while the chandeliers above them burned with the same steady glow they had offered all night, indifferent to truth, to inheritance, to children carrying the last instructions of dying mothers. Naomi had gone quiet again after Ethan spoke, but her silence was not empty. It had the shape of effort, the shape of a child standing very still because stillness was the only way to keep from shaking. Mrs. Brooks remained half a step in front of her, not shielding her in any obvious way, only making it clear with the angle of her body that no one would get to the girl without first passing through someone who had decided, after too many years of obedience, that she was done mistaking silence for loyalty. Victoria let out a slow breath and smoothed one hand over the side of her gown. When she spoke again, her voice had recovered its softness, but Ethan heard the crack beneath it now, the strain of somebody rearranging strategy in real time. "You are tired, and this child is exhausted," she said. "Whatever this is, it does not belong in a ballroom after midnight with staff listening from doorways and legal papers spread across dinner linen. Let us move this to your study upstairs. Privately. With dignity." Ethan almost laughed, though nothing in him was amused. Dignity. The word had served Victoria well for years. She used it the way other people used locks. Put dignity over a secret, and many people would step back out of politeness before they ever noticed what was being hidden. He looked toward the ballroom doors. Beyond the glass, two security men still lingered down the corridor, pretending not to look in. Down the far side hall, kitchen staff drifted in and out of shadow, every movement quieter than normal, all of them aware that the story of this night had not ended when the guests were told to leave. Ethan lowered the recorder to the table beside Lena's letter. "No," he said. "Nothing goes upstairs. Not the papers. Not the child. Not the recorder. We stay where there are witnesses." Victoria's face hardened in a way he had not seen before, not because she had never lost control, but because she had always lost it in private. "Witnesses to what?" she asked. "To a fantasy built from resentment?" Naomi finally spoke, her voice thin but clear. "My mama was not resentful." Victoria turned to her with that same polished pity she had worn all evening, but now it sat wrong on her features, like borrowed jewelry. "Sweetheart, grown people can be many things at once. Sad, proud, confused." Naomi's eyes filled, though the tears did not fall. She was tired, the girl said. She was scared, but she was not confused. She remembered everything. She remembered the coffee shop where he forgot his wallet and pretended he did not. She remembered he hates mint and hot chocolate. She remembered the thunderstorm in Boston when the lights went out, and he said rich people are only brave until the elevator stops working. Ethan's breath caught. Boston. The Fairmont on Copley Square, 10 years ago, a storm rolling in off the harbor, emergency lights flickering in the hall, Lena laughing in the dark because the great Ethan Whitmore had admitted he did not trust elevators during lightning. He had never told that story to anyone else. Never to Victoria. Mrs. Brooks looked from Naomi to Ethan and then down at the floor, as if the intimacy of truth had become almost too painful to witness. Victoria did not answer right away. For the first time that night, she looked not elegant, not composed, but cornered by memory she could not control because it belonged to other people. "Coincidences can be collected," she said at last, though the sentence lacked conviction even before it ended. Ethan reached for the recorder again. His thumb hovered over the worn play button. Naomi saw it and took one involuntary step toward him before stopping herself. "She said there is a part near the middle," Naomi whispered. "Not the beginning. The beginning is her coughing a lot." Her hand rose to her coat collar, gripping the fabric there. "She said if you heard her cough first, you might get sad and turn it off before the part that matters." That sentence almost undid him. It was so painfully Lena, practical even in weakness, still trying to manage his heart from a distance because she knew exactly where it failed. Ethan pressed play. At first there was only static, then the faint mechanical hiss of a cheap microphone coming alive. A rustle, a shallow breath, another. Naomi lowered her eyes. Mrs. Brooks closed her own for a moment as if bracing. Then Lena's voice emerged from the tiny speaker, thinner than Ethan remembered, roughened by illness, but unmistakably hers. "If this reaches you, Ethan," she said, followed by a cough she tried and failed to turn away from, "then somebody important has already failed us." The sound of her voice after all those years moved through the ballroom like a second presence. Ethan did not blink. He could not. Lena continued, speaking slowly, pausing for air. She said she was making the recording because letters could be intercepted and memories doubted. She said Naomi was real, brilliant, stubborn, and loved. She said she had spent years trying to find one route to him that had not already been sealed off. Then her voice sharpened, gathering what little strength she had left around the thing that mattered most. "If he is still beside Victoria when you hear this," Lena said, "tell him to check the family trust revisions. The version she wants signed removes any future claim from a child not acknowledged before execution. That language was not there the first time his lawyers drafted it. She had it added after she learned about Naomi. Nobody in the ballroom breathed. The recorder hissed softly in Ethan's hand. Across from him, Victoria's face lost the last of its warmth. And Naomi, tiny beneath the chandeliers, looked up at him with the exhausted sorrow of a child who had carried the truth all the way to a room full of powerful adults and had finally made one of them hear it. The last word from the recorder seemed to stay in the air long after the sound itself ended. Ethan did not press stop right away. He stood there with the small device in his hand, listening to the soft electronic hiss that followed Lena's voice, as if some part of him believed she might come back and say one more thing if he waited long enough. Across the ballroom, the chandeliers glowed with the same polished warmth they had offered all evening, but now the light felt false, almost theatrical, too golden for a room that had just been stripped bare. Naomi's face had gone very still. Children sometimes cried when they were frightened. Naomi looked past crying now. She looked like someone who had crossed a bridge and sighed herself and could not go back. Mrs. Brooks pressed a hand lightly to her own throat, her composure held together by years of discipline and one final stubborn thread of loyalty to the truth. Victoria stood near the end of the table in white silk and diamonds, but whatever elegance had protected her an hour ago was gone. In its place was something colder. Not panic exactly. Calculation under pressure. The kind that moved faster when exposed. Ethan set the recorder down beside the letter with a care that made the silence feel even sharper. When he lifted his eyes to Victoria, there was no confusion left in them now, only the slow, devastating clarity of a man rearranging his understanding of the last 10 years in real time. "You knew," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Victoria folded her arms, then let them fall again, as if even she could feel how defensive the gesture would look under these lights. "I knew there had once been claims," she said carefully. "Unstable claims. Stories. Women appear around men like you all the time, Ethan. They say what they think grief, loneliness, or guilt will make you believe." Naomi's eyes flashed then, not with childish temper, but with hurt so old it had sharpened into instinct. "My mama was not a story," she said. The sentence landed in the ballroom with a force far beyond its volume. Ethan heard it the way he imagined a judge heard the truth after too many rehearsed testimonies. Victoria turned to the child with polished disbelief. "No one said she was." "You did," Naomi whispered. "Just nicer." Mrs. Brooks shut her eyes for 1 second, as if the courage of that small correction had cost more than anyone in the room understood. Ethan drew a long breath, but it did nothing to settle the pressure building in his chest. He looked at the trust binder again, then opened it to the summary pages under the contingent air language Lena had named in the recording. His eyes scanned faster this time, not because he suddenly understood the legal architecture, but because he now knew where the trap lived. There it was again, buried in refined language and numbered subsections, beneficiaries formally acknowledged prior to execution. Standing documentation. No retroactive claim absent express amendment by acting trustees. It was elegant, bloodless, catastrophic. If he had signed tonight, Naomi would not simply have been left out. She would have been left out on purpose, with the authority of his own signature sealing the door behind her. He could feel his thumb wanting to tap the edge of the page, an old habit Lena had once teased him about when he was angry and trying not to show it. Naomi noticed. "She told me you do that," the girl said softly. Ethan looked up. The child gave a tiny, sad nod. "She said when your hands get quiet, your thumb tells on you." That nearly broke him. Not because it was clever, because it was intimate. Because Lena had kept teaching Naomi who he was even while believing he might never come. Victoria shifted her weight. "This proves nothing about paternity," she said, reaching for the last dry island of defense available to her. "At most it proves a dying woman believed what she wanted to believe. You cannot dismantle years of legal planning because a child arrives with a recording and a resemblance." Ethan turned one page, then another, and found the revision history attached to the final draft. His gaze fixed on a notation in the margin, one most people would never notice because it looked administrative, routine, harmless. "Requested adjustment per VW consultation, inserted after private review." The initials sat there like a fingerprint left on glass. He did not speak for several seconds. Naomi looked from his face to the papers. reading emotion where she could not yet read law. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan lifted the binder without taking his eyes off the page. "The clause was changed after a private review," he said. At her request, Victoria's face lost what little color remained. That note could mean anything. "No," Ethan said. "Tonight it means exactly what Lena said it meant." At that moment the ballroom doors opened and Harold Benton stepped in from the corridor, gray overcoat unbuttoned, silver hair slightly wind-touched from the cold outside. The kind of man who always looked as though he had been summoned from the middle of a more important decision. He took in the near-empty ballroom, the abandoned tables, Mrs. Brooks by the service hall, Naomi in her thin coat, Victoria in white silk, and Ethan standing over the trust binder like it contained a body. Harold's expression changed by degrees, legal caution giving way to genuine alarm. "You said it was urgent," he began, but Ethan cut in before he could say more. He slid the binder across the table toward him, then placed Lena's letter on top of it, and the recorder beside both. "Read the clause under contingent heirs," Ethan said. "Then tell me why my future was nearly signed away in front of a room full of witnesses by people who thought a 9-year-old girl would never make it past the front door." Harold Benton did not touch the letter first. He touched the binder. That was who he was. 30 years of estate law had trained him to look for the knife before the blood. He set his overcoat across the back of a chair, loosened his scarf, and pulled the binder closer beneath the chandelier light. The ballroom had gone so quiet that the soft drag of paper against linen sounded almost indecent. Naomi stood near the edge of the table with her hands clasped under her chin now, not praying, not quite, but holding herself together with the same fierce concentration she had worn all night. Mrs. Brooks moved to her side and, without a word, rested one hand lightly between the child's shoulders. Victoria remained standing, every inch of her still composed from a distance, though Harold noticed at once the stiffness in her jaw and the way Ethan was no longer giving her the courtesy of looking confused. "Contingent heirs," Harold murmured, scanning. His brows lowered. He turned one page back, then forward again, reading the clause twice, then the revision note Ethan had found in the margin. The color changed in his face the way winter light changes in an office window, subtle at first, then impossible to miss. "Who requested this insertion?" he asked. Ethan did not answer. He only looked at Victoria. Harold followed the silence to its source and understood enough to stand straighter. "This language was not in the March draft," he said, "nor the June consolidation memo. It appears here only in the final execution packet." He tapped the notation once. "Requested adjustment per consultation. Initialed VW." There should have been a supplementary advisory attached to any clause this restrictive. Victoria gave a thin smile, but it arrived too late to feel natural. "Then perhaps your office made an administrative omission, Harold." Harold did not smile back. "My office does not omit notices that alter future lineal standing." Naomi did not understand every word, but she understood the temperature in the room. Ethan could see that. He could see her trying to read grown people the way other children read bedtime stories, searching tone, posture, pauses, all the places truth leaked out when language became too expensive. "Explain it plainly," Ethan said. Harold turned toward him, then glanced once at Naomi, recalibrating. "If you had signed tonight," he said carefully, "any child not formally acknowledged before execution would face nearly impossible barriers to claims standing under the trust. Not impossible in theory, but in practice?" He exhaled through his nose. "It would have taken years. Private litigation, hostile review, reputation risk, delay long enough to bury justice under procedure." Naomi's eyes widened. "So she would have locked me out," she said softly. No one corrected her wording because it was simpler and truer than any legal phrase in the binder. Harold looked at the child for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes." Ethan felt something cold settle into place inside him. Anger had heat. This was beyond heat now. This was precision, the kind that arrives only after grief finds shape. He picked up Lena's letter and handed it to Harold. "Read this." Harold did. He read quickly at first, then slower. By the second page he had removed his glasses, polished them with a folded handkerchief, and put them back on as if clean lenses might somehow soften what the words were doing to the room. When he finished, he did not set the pages down immediately. He looked at Naomi first, really looked at her, at the small coat, The tired eyes. The careful stillness. Then he turned toward Ethan with a face no longer guarded by professional neutrality. Did you know? Ethan asked him. Harold's answer came without delay. No, he glanced at Victoria. If I had known there was even a credible possibility of a biological child outside the current estate structure, I would have frozen all revisions until independent review. Victoria folded her arms again. Credible possibility, she repeated. That is the phrase that matters. We still do not have proof. We have sentiment. We have timing. We have a letter and a recording from a dead woman who can no longer be cross-examined. Naomi looked as if the sentence had physically chilled her, not because it was loud, but because it made her mother sound like an inconvenience to be processed. Ethan noticed, and this time he moved without thinking. He pulled out the chair nearest him at the head table and looked at Naomi. Sit down, he said gently. She hesitated, probably because no one dressed like him had ever offered her a seat at a table like this. Mrs. Brooks gave her a tiny nod. Naomi climbed onto the chair, her feet not reaching the floor, purple backpack still visible by the drape like a piece of another world that had somehow survived entry into this one. Ethan took off his suit jacket and placed it over the back of the chair so the cold from the ballroom air would not reach her shoulders. It was an instinctive act, and the moment it happened something in Victoria's expression darkened. Not jealousy exactly. Something meaner. Recognition. She was watching a bond begin before she could stop it. Harold saw that too. Proof can be obtained, he said. Quietly and immediately. There are emergency labs. Court-recognized paternity procedures. Chain of custody. Whatever is needed. Naomi's fingers rested on the edge of the linen. I am not lying, she whispered. Ethan turned toward her. I know. The words came out before caution could catch them. Naomi searched his face, and what he saw in her expression nearly undid him. Not joy. She was too careful for that. It was relief mixed with disbelief, the look of a child hearing the first safe sentence after too many dangerous ones. Victoria stepped toward the table. Ethan, be careful. Compassion is admirable, but you are making declarations in a highly compromised situation. Harold closed the binder with firm hands. No, he said. What is compromised is this document. And unless you can provide a lawful explanation for why you personally requested exclusionary air language without disclosing the potential existence of a claimant, I strongly advise you to stop speaking. The ballroom seemed to draw in around those words. Mrs. Brooks looked down, perhaps because she had waited years to hear someone with power say them aloud. Victoria's face went pale under the chandelier light. Ethan picked up the recorder again, turned it over in his hand, and looked at Harold. There is more on this, he said. Naomi said the important part was in the middle. Lena said somebody important had already failed us. I want the rest heard now. Harold nodded slowly. Then let us hear it. And as Ethan pressed play again, Naomi reached up without thinking and caught the edge of his shirt cuff between two small fingers, not to stop him, only to make sure that this time, when the truth started speaking, he would not turn away. The recorder hissed for a second, then Lena's voice returned, weaker than before, but steadier now, as if she had reached the part she had forced herself to save energy for. Ethan felt Naomi's fingers still lightly holding the edge of his cuff, the smallest possible grip, more faith than pressure, and he did not move away. Around them the ballroom stayed suspended in that strange after-midnight stillness, all candle glow and abandoned champagne and white flowers that now seemed to belong to somebody else's celebration. If you are hearing this part, Lena said through the tiny speaker, then Naomi got farther than I ever could. There was a pause, a faint rustle, then her breath catching before she continued. Listen carefully, Ethan. I did not lose you all at once. I lost you in pieces. First the calls stopped reaching you. Then the letters. Then men I had never seen before began telling me your offices had no record of me. Your assistants had instructions. Your schedule was sealed. Your homes were private. And your life had moved on. Ethan stared at the recorder as though he could see her through it, somewhere in a dim rented room or under hospital light, speaking into cheap plastic because it was all she had left between truth and erasure. The first time I knew this was not random, Lena continued, was outside St. Margaret's on Lexington. Naomi had a fever. I had been sitting in urgent care for 6 hours. When I came out, a woman in a cream coat was waiting beside a black car. She knew my name. She knew Naomi's age. She knew I had tried to send you a photograph. Victoria's face tightened so sharply that even Naomi, who did not know every history in the room, turned and looked at her. Harold Benton lifted his head from the table, every legal instinct in him suddenly alert. Ethan's mind moved back across the years with sickening speed. Cream coat. Victoria had owned 3 nearly identical winter coats for years. Always the same expensive shade, the same clean silhouette, the same preference for looking soft while saying hard things. On the recorder, Lena coughed again, but when she spoke next her voice had sharpened around pain like wire around glass. She was polite, Lena said. That was the part that made it worse. She smiled while she told me that men like you do not survive scandal by indulging surprises. She said if I cared about my daughter, I would stop bringing a child into a world that had not chosen her. She called it mercy. She offered me an envelope thick enough to pay rent for months. Naomi lowered her eyes then, not because she was ashamed, but because children understood the humiliation of hearing out loud just how cheaply the world thought they could be negotiated away. Ethan's jaw locked. He could feel his own heartbeat in his throat now, slow and punishing. Victoria inhaled to speak, but Harold raised one hand without looking at her, and the authority in the gesture stopped her cold. I said no, Lena went on. I said Ethan would never agree to this if he knew. She said, and I remember every word. Ethan only knows what serves the future he is building. You and your child are not in it. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. He did remember the future he had been building then. Clean lines, public stability, investments wrapped in confidence. A marriage proposal everyone said made sense. He had mistaken smoothness for truth because smoothness was easier to live with. On the recorder, Lena's breathing roughened, but she kept going. A week later, I tried again. This time I brought Naomi to your office. She was wearing the yellow knit hat my aunt made for her, the one with the crooked flower stitched on the side. She was so small she kept falling asleep on my shoulder while the lobby lights reflected off the marble floor. We waited 40 minutes. Then a man from security came down with no badge visible and said I was not welcome to return. He did not ask my name. He already knew it. Naomi's hand slipped from Ethan's cuff to her lap. Her lips parted slightly. The yellow hat, she whispered, almost to herself. I still have that. Ethan turned toward her. The child looked stunned by the memory reaching backward beyond her own understanding, as if she had just discovered that something ordinary in a drawer at home had once stood at the center of a broken road. Mrs. Brooks touched Naomi's shoulder again, gently, and the girl leaned into the contact without seeming to realize she had done it. Lena's voice filled the ballroom once more. If this sounds impossible, it did to me too. For a long time I thought maybe I was just unlucky. Maybe powerful people had assistants and walls and doors that closed faster than other people's. But then she came to see me again after Naomi's 2nd birthday. Different coat. Same smile. She brought records. Not official ones. Copies. Notes on your schedule, your flights, charity dinners, private weekends. She wanted me to understand how completely access to you could be managed. She said if I kept trying, I would only teach my daughter what rejection feels like. Harold looked up sharply at that. Managed, he repeated under his breath, almost like he was filing the word for later use. Ethan did not speak. He could not yet trust what would come out if he did. Victoria finally stepped forward, her composure no longer polished but strained at the seams. This is still a recording, she said. An unverified account by a woman with every reason to invent a villain. Naomi's head came up at once. My mama did not invent you. The sentence was quiet, but the whole room heard it. Ethan did too, and he felt something inside him shift beyond anger into grief, so clean it almost hurt more. Because Naomi was right. Lena had not invented a villain. Ethan had invited one into his life and called her order. The recorder crackled softly. Then Lena spoke again, lower now, as if the act of telling had cost her. If you are finally listening, Ethan, then there is one more thing you need to know. She did not just keep us from you. She learned enough about your legal world to make sure Naomi could be erased later too. If papers are ever put in front of you that reward acknowledged heirs and bury unknown ones, do not sign them. That clause will not be an accident. It will be the last door she closes. The sound cut there into a long wash of static, and in the silence that followed, Harold Benton slowly removed his glasses and looked straight at Victoria like a man seeing not a socialite, not a fiancé, but evidence. The static faded, but the damage stayed. It stayed in the air above the white linen table, in the candle flames that seemed suddenly too fragile for the room, in the way Naomi sat so still in the oversized chair, as if any movement might break the thin mercy of finally being believed. Ethan did not touch the recorder again. He left it on the table beside Lena's letter and the poisoned trust binder, 3 objects no larger than ordinary things, yet heavy enough to split a life in half. Harold Benton stood with his glasses in one hand, studying Victoria with a severity that no longer belonged to polite society. Mrs. Brooks kept her palm on Naomi's shoulder, the child leaning just slightly into that touch now, exhausted enough to stop pretending she needed nothing. Ethan looked at Victoria, and for the first time in years he saw no future around her. No shared calendar. No charity photos. No wedding plans. No careful public symmetry. He saw only the architecture of concealment. White flowers. Soft voice. Closed doors. Missed letters. A child on a subway with school papers in her backpack because all the adults with power had failed to make room for her anywhere else. "Tell me I heard it wrong," Ethan said. His voice was low, almost stripped of sound, but every word carried. Victoria's chin lifted. "You heard the accusations of a bitter woman who wanted what she could not have," she said. Naomi looked down at her hands. Ethan noticed that at once. The child had gone quiet in a different way now, not with fear, but with the dull ache of hearing. Her mother reduced again, even after death, even after the truth had dragged itself into the light. He moved around the end of the table and crouched beside Naomi's chair so that when he spoke again, he was no longer above her. He was level with her. "Look at me," he said gently. Naomi did. Her eyes were shiny but steady. Ethan swallowed once before the next words came. "None of this was your fault." The sentence was meant for a child, but it cut through him on its way out, because the opposite truth had already rooted itself inside his chest. This was not Naomi's fault. It was not Lena's fault. It was not fate, or misunderstanding, or bad timing dressed up as tragedy. It was a chain of choices. Access managed. Messages intercepted. A future edited by people who thought decency was something money could outvote. Naomi searched his face, as if testing whether kindness from a man like him could be trusted yet. She said, "Maybe you would be mad first," Naomi whispered. "My mama said some people have to be mad before they can be sad." Ethan almost smiled, but grief was too close to the surface for it to fully form. "She was right," he said. Naomi gave the smallest nod, as if that answer matched a memory she had been carrying. Behind them, Harold set his glasses back on and opened the trust binder one more time, not because he needed new evidence, but because lawyers often looked at paper when they were deciding how much of the truth could survive the next 10 minutes. "Ethan," he said carefully, "there are only 2 possibilities now. Either Ms. Carter fabricated a level of detail that intersects with internal revisions she should never have known about, or someone with proximity to your personal and legal affairs used that proximity to interfere over a period of years. One explanation is improbable. The other is emerging as documented." Victoria let out a breath that bordered on a laugh, but carried no warmth. "Documented? By whom? A dead woman and a frightened employee?" Mrs. Brooks stiffened, but Ethan rose before she had to answer. "A frightened employee," he repeated, turning toward Victoria, "who still showed more honor tonight than anyone I have paid to protect me." The words landed harder because they were calm. Victoria's face tightened. "I protected you," she said. "From chaos. From scandal. From the kind of complications that ruin men in your position." Ethan stared at her. "You mean the kind of complications that look like a black woman and her child arriving where you thought they did not belong?" The sentence hung there, and with it came the deeper ugliness nobody in the room could pretend not to hear anymore. Not just class. Not just control. Something colder, older, more poisonous. The sort of certainty that some families are treated as legacy and others as liability. Naomi's lips parted slightly. Mrs. Brooks closed her eyes for half a second, maybe from sorrow, maybe from relief that someone had finally said aloud what had been allowed to hide beneath manners for too long. Victoria drew herself up. "Do not make this into something theatrical and moral," she said. "I dealt with a risk." Harold looked at her sharply. "A child is not a risk," he said. Naomi's fingers tightened against the edge of the chair. Ethan heard the tiny scrape of her nails on polished wood and felt something inside him give way. He had spent years being admired for composure, for discipline, for measured response. But composure was useless now. Discipline could not undo birthdays missed, fevers unattended, subway rides taken alone, a yellow knit hat in a clinic lobby where his daughter had once waited for him without knowing what his face would feel like in real life. He turned away from Victoria and looked at Naomi again. Her braids had loosened more around her face. Her coat still looked too thin for the cold. One shoelace had come partly undone and dragged near the chair leg. Ordinary details. Brutal details. They made the whole catastrophe real in a way legal clauses never could. "Did she ever tell you," he asked softly, "whether she thought I knew?" Naomi shook her head. "Not at first," she said. "Later she said she did not think you knew. She said rich people can be tricked too, especially when the lies are prettier than the truth." Ethan closed his eyes. The line was so painfully Lena that it almost felt like being touched by a ghost. When he opened them, he looked at Harold. "Call the lab. Tonight. I want emergency paternity verification, full chain of custody, whatever is fastest and cleanest. I want every security log. From this house, my offices, and the old residences for the last 10 years preserved before sunrise. I want every draft revision tied to this trust frozen immediately." Harold nodded once, already reaching for his phone. Victoria stepped forward, genuine alarm breaking through at last. "You cannot do all that in the middle of the night based on emotion." Ethan faced her with a stillness that ended the argument before she finished it. "No," he said. "I am doing it because a little girl had to carry the truth to my table herself, and I will not fail her twice." Harold moved toward the far end of the ballroom, already speaking in the low-clipped voice lawyers used when sleep, decorum, and ordinary timing had all become irrelevant. His shoes crossed the marble in measured steps, phone to his ear, while staff in the corridor melted farther back into shadow, understanding without being told that the center of the house had shifted. Ethan remained beside Naomi's chair for a moment longer. Up close he could hear the small unevenness in her breathing now, the exhaustion she had kept locked down all night finally beginning to show through the cracks. 9 years old, and still trying to sit like a witness. Mrs. Brooks noticed it too. She leaned down and asked softly, "Sweetheart, have you eaten since school?" Naomi blinked as if the question had arrived from another planet. Then she shook her head once. Ethan felt the answer hit him with a strange, immediate shame. The gala tables around them still held silver trays of untouched petit fours, tiny lobster rolls, sliced fruit fanned into perfect arrangements no guest would remember tomorrow. A room full of abundance, and his daughter had come to it hungry. He looked toward the service hall. "Bring something warm," he said. "Nothing fancy. Tea if she wants it. Soup. Bread." Mrs. Brooks nodded and disappeared through the side corridor. Naomi watched her go, then looked back at Ethan with a caution that hurt to see. "You do not have to do all that," she whispered. Ethan pulled out the chair beside hers and sat, not at the head of the table this time, but next to her. The position changed the entire room. "Yes," he said gently. "I do." Naomi lowered her gaze to the white linen, fingers tracing the seam near her plate as if expensive cloth obeyed a different set of rules than the fabric she knew. "My mama said rich people get kind when they feel guilty," she murmured. The honesty of it should have embarrassed him. Instead it felt deserved. "She may have been right about me too," Ethan said. Naomi glanced up, surprised by the answer. "But guilt is not the same thing as lying," he added. "And I am done lying to myself tonight." That seemed to matter to her. Not enough to relax. Not enough to trust. But enough that the hard line in her shoulders softened by half an inch. Across the ballroom, Victoria had not sat down. She stood near one of the tall floral arrangements, white silk luminous beneath the chandeliers. Arms folded now because the performance of ease had finally become too difficult to maintain. Her face looked drawn in a way that no makeup could quite conceal. Every few seconds her eyes moved toward the doors, as if calculating exits, witnesses, leverage, sequence. Ethan saw all of it. He saw, too, how Naomi avoided looking at her directly now, not out of fear alone, but because children often learned early that some adults became more dangerous when watched. A moment later Mrs. Brooks returned carrying a tray with a plain white bowl, a cup of tea, a cloth napkin, and 2 thick slices of buttered bread. The sight of it in that glittering ballroom was almost absurdly tender. Naomi stared at the soup as if she had not expected anyone to remember her body after all this attention had gone to her truth. It is chicken noodle, Mrs. Brooks said softly. Not too hot. Naomi looked at Ethan first, asking permission without words in the old reflex of a child used to reading power before reaching for comfort. Ethan nodded. Go ahead. She picked up the spoon with both care and hunger, taking the first bite so quietly it almost broke him. Mrs. Brooks set the tea down beside her, then reached into her apron pocket and produced a wrapped peppermint. For later, she said, slipping it near the bread plate. Naomi gave her the faintest smile of the night. It changed her whole face for 1 second and made Ethan feel the full weight of everything he had missed. Harold returned before Naomi had finished half the bowl. The lab team can be here within 40 minutes, he said. Private entrance. Mobile unit. Full documentation. I also reached the records officer at St. Margaret's. They can release archived maternity logs to counsel with emergency authorization if there is a credible claim connected to estate standing and identity suppression. Ethan rose slowly from his chair. Do it, Harold nodded. I already have. Victoria let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. You are mobilizing half the city in the middle of the night over one allegation. Harold turned toward her. No, he said. Over a pattern. Then he looked at Ethan. There is more. The hospital records officer recognized the name Lena Carter immediately. She said there was an unusual notation attached to the file. Restricted visitor interference complaint, filed, and then sealed pending administrative review. It was never fully processed because the patient was transferred before the hearing date. Ethan went still. Visitor interference, he repeated. The phrase sounded sterile, bureaucratic, almost harmless. But beneath it he heard hospital corridors, exhausted mothers, doors closed by smiling hands. Naomi had stopped eating. Her spoon hovered over the bowl. My mama said there was a nurse who tried to help, she said quietly. Harold nodded. Dr. Melissa Grant. She is retired now, but the hospital still had an emergency number on file because she consults on records disputes. I left a message. She called back while I was in the corridor. Ethan's eyes lifted. And Harold's expression shifted, not towards certainty exactly, but towards something close enough to rattle the room. She remembers Lena. She remembers the child. And she remembers a complaint about a woman in an ivory coat who kept appearing on the floor claiming to represent family interests despite not being listed as next of kin. Naomi looked slowly toward Victoria then, and this time she did not look away. The room seemed to narrow around that gaze. Victoria straightened, every line of her body hardening into defiance. This is nonsense, she said. Retired staff do not build evidence. They build memories. Harold did not blink. Sometimes memories survive because someone worked very hard to make the paperwork disappear. Ethan felt something inside him settle into place with terrible calm. It was no longer the shaking kind of anger. It was the kind that rearranged a life. He looked at Naomi, at the soup spoon still in her hand, at the bread she had only half eaten, at the child who had arrived in worn shoes and carried more dignity than any adult in the room. Then he turned to Harold. Bring Dr. Grant here, he said. Tonight. Harold gave a short nod. She is already on her way. Victoria took a step back before she seemed to realize she had moved. It was small, barely a foot on marble, but everyone saw it. Naomi saw it too. Her voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. She remembers. Ethan looked down at the girl beside the untouched tea and the half-empty bowl. Yes, he said, and for the first time all night his answer held something warmer than grief. And this time, so will I. The ballroom clock had just passed 1 in the morning when Dr. Melissa Grant arrived through the private side entrance in a charcoal coat, still dusted with cold. She was in her late 60s now, silver-haired, upright, carrying a leather satchel with the kind of care that belonged to women who had spent their lives guarding facts inside fragile places. The moment she stepped beneath the chandelier light, her eyes went first to Naomi. Not to Ethan, not to Victoria, to Naomi, sitting in the oversized chair with a spoon resting in her bowl and tiredness gathered around her like a second coat. Dr. Grant stopped walking. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth. That face, she whispered. My God. Ethan felt the room tighten around those 2 words. Dr. Grant crossed the marble floor with measured steps and crouched just enough to see Naomi at eye level. You had a yellow knit hat, she said softly. Crooked flower on the side. Your mother kept apologizing because you would not let anyone else hold you. Naomi stared at her, stunned by being remembered by someone who had no reason to lie. I still have the hat, she said. Dr. Grant nodded, eyes brightening with grief and recognition. I knew I remembered correctly. She straightened then and turned to Ethan, and whatever warmth had touched her face when she looked at the child disappeared into something sterner. Your daughter was born on a Tuesday at 11:23 in the morning, she said. Lena was terrified and exhausted and absolutely determined that your name be written down in the file exactly as she said it. She repeated it twice because she was afraid someone would make a mistake on purpose. No one moved. Even the candle flames seemed to hold still. Harold Benton stepped closer, phone already in hand. Doctor, for the record, are you willing to provide a formal statement? Dr. Grant did not look at him. I am willing to provide the truth, she said. Then she reached into her satchel and removed a thin manila folder, old at the corners but carefully preserved. I keep copies when administrative complaints vanish too neatly. Harold exhaled under his breath. Victoria went pale. Dr. Grant opened the folder and withdrew 2 documents. This is the visitor interference complaint Lena filed. It names a woman presenting herself as someone close to Mr. Whitmore and trying to influence access and documentation. This is my own incident summary, signed and dated, after I found the original complaint had been flagged for internal hold. Ethan took the pages. His hands were steady now in a way that frightened even him. The first document listed Lena Carter, newborn female child, concern regarding third-party contact, intimidation, and attempts to alter notification records. The second included one line that made the entire room feel suddenly too small to stand in. Woman in ivory coat insisted family legacy must be protected from claims that would not fit the life he is building. Ethan looked up slowly. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. There are moments when guilt still hopes for elegance. This was not one of them. Naomi watched Ethan's face as if the future itself might be written there. He turned from the papers to the child beside the half-finished soup, to the braids loosening around her face, to the purple backpack near the drape, to the shoelace still slightly untied, and he understood with awful clarity that legacy had never been the buildings with his name on them, never the foundations, never the headlines, never the trust structure drafted in 12-point legal language. Legacy was sitting in front of him in worn shoes, having crossed a city alone to keep one last promise to her mother. Ethan set the papers down. Then, slowly, in the middle of the empty ballroom, he lowered himself to one knee in front of Naomi. The movement was quiet, but it changed the whole room. Naomi's eyes widened. She did not smile. She did not rush toward him. She only looked at him with that same careful, searching hope children carry when life has taught them not to trust the first good thing. Ethan's voice, when it came, was rough with everything he could not undo. Naomi, he said, I cannot give you back the birthdays I missed. I cannot change the nights your mother waited and I did not come, because I did not know where to look. But I know where to look now. Her chin trembled once. Would you have come? She asked. The question was so small it barely disturbed the air, but it cut deeper than accusation ever could. Ethan did not look away. Yes, he said. I would have come for you. Every time. Naomi held his gaze for one breath, then another, as if measuring whether a man like him understood the weight of promises at all. Finally, she lifted one small hand and touched his cheek with the uncertain gentleness of a child testing whether something powerful could also be real. Ethan closed his eyes at the contact for just a second. When he opened them again, there were tears in his face and no effort left to hide them. Behind him, Harold was already instructing staff to secure the documents, freeze the trust, and notify the lab team. Mrs. Brooks was crying quietly into one gloved hand. Dr. Grant stood with her satchel clasped against her side like a witness who had carried the truth long enough. And Victoria, still in white silk beneath the chandeliers, looked at last like what she had spent years trying not to be seen as, not refined, not necessary, not inevitable. Only a woman who had mistaken access for power and silence for victory. Naomi's hand remained against Ethan's face for one more second before she whispered, Mama said kindness is how you know who is telling the truth. Ethan placed his hand gently over hers. The ballroom had never seemed so quiet. Not empty. Quiet. Like a room after a storm when all the expensive things have lost their meaning and only the human ones remain. He had built a life people envied. But in the end, the truth arrived in the voice of a little girl who had nothing except courage, and that was enough to make every lie in the room finally kneel.